I want to speak to you today about an issue that comes up quite frequently with my clients, and that is should they speak to the police? Um, should they speak to the police before they get an attorney? Should they speak to the police after they've hired an attorney? That's the question I'm going to answer today. In order to understand why you shouldn't talk to the police if you've been accused of a crime, you first have to understand how our legal system works. Our legal system is what they call an adversarial system. An adversarial system is different than, say, an inquisitorial system like some European countries have. In an inquisitorial system, the judge takes an active role in the investigation of the case. In our system, in the adversarial system, the judge doesn't take a role in the investigation. He's what they call a neutral magistrate. And in our system, the neutral magistrate acts as a sort of referee between two competing sides. In a criminal case, that would be the prosecution and the defense. The theory behind the adversarial system, and the reason some people believe that it's a good system, is that when two sides are competing, the idea is that the victory between those two will be justice. Whether that's true or not, and what the likelihood of that is always up for debate, but that is the theory behind the system. You also need to understand what the police believe their role is in the adversarial system. Now, it's hard to say what any particular police officer may believe their role is, but in general, police officers quite frequently see their role in the adversarial system as being on the prosecutor's team. They see themselves as a player in the adversarial system. What this means is that the police officer is not on your team. We often see the results of the police seeing themselves this way in the way they conduct their investigations. We see them turning your words on you, being selective in their investigation of the evidence, picking the things that may help their case, ignoring the things that will not. When you see this type of behavior, that behavior is probably the direct result of the police officers seeing themselves as a player on the prosecution's team. They see it as their job to convict the defendant. When you are first charged with a crime as a defendant, you have three very big advantages over the prosecution in the case. The first advantage you have is the right to remain silent. That means that they can't force you to talk. They can't make you talk, which is very important in a topic like this when we're discussing whether you should speak with the police or not. The second thing you have is a presumption of innocence, which means that you're presumed to be innocent until the state can prove otherwise, and they must prove that at a trial, which leads us to your third biggest advantage, and that is that it's the state's burden to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. You start off in a very good position in a criminal case with huge advantages over the prosecution. But when you choose to speak to the police, first of all, you're waiving your right to remain silent, which means you're giving up one of your big advantages in the case. And then that can then in turn be used to overcome your presumption of innocence at a trial, and it works to bolster the state's case to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Quickly, your case will begin to fall apart. And as you can see in criminal cases today, in jurisdictions across the United States, prosecutions have very high conviction rates. And the reason they do is because of mistakes that defendants make on a daily basis. One of them is speaking to the police. But you may say, I'm innocent. I want the police to know that, so they don't charge me with a crime, so that they don't take my reputation and drag it through the mud. And I can understand that. So the next question you have to ask yourself is, what can be gained by speaking to the police? Can I convince them that I'm innocent? Well, first you have to remember, like we talked about earlier, who they are and who they work for, and who they believe they work for, and what they believe their role is in the adversarial system. because of the way they view their position here, they're going to twist your words. They're going to give the words you say an uncharitable interpretation. Another problem that I see quite frequently when we go to trial on cases like this is they're going to ask you questions that a prosecutor would never be able to ask you at a jury trial. First of all, because you have a right to remain silent, so they would never actually even get to ask you questions if you chose not to take the stand. But if you did choose to take the stand, we would be able to object to certain questions they may ask, maybe questions that call for speculation, or questions that may ask you about certain things that had happened to you or that you had done in the past. And quite frequently, the police officers can ask you those questions in an interview that is audio taped, and then that audio tape comes into evidence at a trial, and then those questions can all be asked by the police officer in the audio. There are questions that they could have never asked you in that way at a jury trial without pulling an objection and having that objection sustained. And so that's another problem with speaking to the police. Another problem with speaking to the police is everything you say to the police in that interview will be used against you at some point. Let's say you say something incriminating, or at least something that they interpret as incriminating. Well, that's going to be used against you at a jury trial to try to convict you. Let's say that everything you say is perfect, that you completely absolve yourself of any criminal liability whatsoever. Well, and that doesn't happen very often, but I have seen it happen. And then what happens is, ultimately they take a plea deal sometime down the road. And at the sentencing hearing, the attorney attempts to argue, Judge, they've taken responsibility from the beginning, and they're taking responsibility and accountability here today. Well, naturally, the prosecutor gets up and says, Judge, that isn't what happened. They haven't taken responsibility and accountability from day one. In fact, the defendant denied everything on day one, and they refer back to the police officer's audio transcripts. So, as you can see, no matter what you say, at some point, what you say can be used against you. So that's another thing to take into consideration. Even if you handle the investigation perfectly and you are perfect in answering police officers every question, which again doesn't happen very often, but if you do, it could still come back to bite you in the butt at some point. Another reason that you don't speak to the police is because everything you say can be used against you in trial. But let's go back to the scenario where you said everything perfectly, that you did everything that you were supposed to do in that interview and didn't make any mistakes. Well, none of that stuff can be used to help you at the trial. Now, this is because of the way the rules of evidence work. The rules of evidence will allow prior inconsistent statements to be used against you at a trial. That's one of the rules of evidence is for impeachment purposes. So if you say one thing in the police interview, but then you come to trial and say something different, they can use what you said in the police interview against you to impeach you. But what can't be used at a trial, except under very limited circumstances, is prior consistent statements. So if you come to trial and you say something, and then you want to say, well, that's also what I said before to the police, you're not going to get to say that, except in some very particular circumstances. So, in summary, the rules of evidence will allow all the bad stuff to come in, and they'll keep out all the good stuff that you said in that interview. So the interview will be a complete waste of time for you. It will only help the prosecution. It will not help your defense. One worry that my clients frequently have is that their silence will be used against them. And they want to talk to the police. They want to talk to the prosecutor. They want to tell them that they're innocent. And they hope that speaking to them will convince them that they're innocent and that they shouldn't be charged. Well, that's not going to happen. The police already think you're guilty. It's their job to convict you. The prosecution thinks they're guilty. They've charged you. Talking to them isn't going to make a difference. But what's more important is what the jury thinks, because they're the ones that have the ultimate decision of deciding whether you're guilty or not guilty. This is what's important to understand. First of all, the prosecution cannot argue that you were silent, therefore you must be guilty. In fact, if they make that argument, you'll probably get a new trial. The courts have determined that that is such a damaging argument to the defense's case that it's unfair and that it cannot be used as an argument at trial. Further, the judge is going to instruct the jury that you do not have to take the stand, you do not have to speak, and that the jury cannot use that as evidence of guilt, that they cannot infer from your decision not to take the stand that you're guilty. And so there's many checks along the way. They're going to make sure that the jury does not take your silence as evidence of guilt. That's your right. That's what goes along with the right to remain silent. The reason that those who have been accused of a crime want to speak to the police is because they want to get their version of the facts out. They want to speak to the police. They want to show the police how credible they are and how the police should believe them over the other witnesses who are testifying against them. And it's understandable that someone would feel that way, but they misunderstand how the system works. More often than not, the police see themselves as being on a team, and they see themselves and their job as to convict. And most of the time, very early on, the police pick someone who they're going to convict, and most of the time the police are simply digging and mining for evidence. And so when you come in and you sit down to be interrogated, the police are digging for evidence against you. So that's more reason than any other to not speak to the police. The clearest evidence that speaking to the police when you've been accused of a crime is a bad thing is that police officers themselves will not speak to the police when they have been accused of a crime. They exercise their right to remain silent. Another clear indication of this is attorneys will hire an attorney, be represented by an attorney, and more often than not, they will exercise their right to remain silent. Take the example of those who are in the know as to what the best course of action is. When police officers and attorneys themselves are exercising their right to remain silent, rather than trying to go to the police and get their side of the story in, you know that that's a good indication that you yourself should be exercising your right to remain silent and not speaking to the police.